If I may take just a moment for our online audience, I will be in Knoxville, Tennessee tonight by the time this video goes up, and then I will be in Raleigh, North Carolina for the Moral Monday March. I'll be meeting several of our viewers there to march together, and if any of you viewing today would like to join us, if you will email me at the address that will appear at the end of the video. Later in the week, I'll be in Holly Hill, South Carolina, visiting with other viewers, then in Birmingham, Alabama over the Memorial Day weekend, and then in Louisville, Kentucky for 3 days after Memorial Day. So I'm always pleased to meet our viewers whenever possible. So if you will just email me over the next few days, I'll look forward to finding an opportunity to greet you. Now, those of you here in Springfield, you may have seen it in the news, and certainly several of you were there on Thursday morning when we gathered with a few union organizers and fast food workers to try to launch a strike against the McDonald's on West Kearney. There were only about 25 people carrying signs and marching at 6 a.m. when the managers unlocked the doors. The management had intimidated all but one of their employees into changing their minds about going on strike that day, but several members of this church marched and chanted on their behalf for a living wage. Now, if there had been 500 of us, we could have closed the store down and forced a conversation with the employers. If there had been 200 of us, we could have at least blocked the drive-through and put a noticeable dent in the morning's business. But there were only a couple of dozen, and within minutes of our arrival, the Springfield police began to show up in force, just as they did the last time we tried to stage a demonstration at a different McDonald's. The North Side residents in poor neighborhoods of this city have a hard time getting the police to respond to crime in their neighborhoods. I've heard complaints that 911 calls to help in cases of domestic violence or even rape can take 1 to 2 hours. However, we were threatening commerce. And so within 15 minutes of this gathering of mostly retirement-age church members and some other do-gooders, there were 8 patrol cars with almost as many armed police officers on the ground as we had sign-wielding senior citizens. And I don't say that to take a jab at the police, whose job it is to keep our city safe and to fight crime. We were, after all, potentially violent criminals. I have always, personally, felt that I have the potential to be a hamburglar. It is only fear of the police that restrains me. I do believe, however, that we should take a moment to consider the juxtaposition of a handful of labor sympathizers standing in the cold in front of a fast food restaurant with an entire congregation of police cars, armed officers, and a paddy wagon standing at the ready to haul us off to jail if anyone slowed down access to the menu board where people were ordering the food-like substances that they sell at McDonald's. The majority of the children in that neighborhood who live below the poverty line, and the majority of children in the Springfield Public Schools live in poverty, but on the north side, it's closer to 75%. Some of their parents are working for $7.50 an hour at McDonald's. And in that part of the town, most young girls, and this is hard to say, most young girls in impoverished neighborhoods will be sexually assaulted before they either drop out of high school or graduate. Most young boys will be all too familiar with violence. We cannot afford, we tell ourselves, to have sufficient police presence to make their world safe. We cannot afford to pay their parents enough to raise them up out of poverty. But as a society, we will spend tax dollars extravagantly to protect commercial businesses. That, my friends, is a fact. It is a fact that I witnessed with my own 2 baby blue eyes on Thursday morning. This is not part of the civil rights movement. This is not part of the labor movement of the 1920s. This is 2014. The city government of Springfield, Missouri will expend almost unlimited resources to prevent the unionization of low-wage workers. It is a fact that we must acknowledge and allow it to sink into our awareness for every time we pull into a drive-through and every time we cast a vote. Now, I'm leaving as soon as we dim the lights in our sanctuary to drive to Raleigh, where I will participate in the Moral Monday March that will take place there tomorrow. I've been wanting to go since I first heard of these demonstrations that started taking place in the capital of North Carolina last year. The movement was started by the Reverend William Barber, who is the state president of the NAACP and who is also an ordained Disciples of Christ pastor. I actually met William Barber at a conference I attended a couple of years ago, and I'll confess that my first impression wasn't that great because he is a traditional Christian thinker. And I was looking then, as I always am, for soulmates in the progressive movement. But though we are not standing on common ground in our approach to religion, William Barber's a very smart man, and he has become a very effective prophet. When the state legislature meets in North Carolina, as they continue to try to restrict the access of minorities to voting places, and they continue to try to take back the rights of women to manage their own bodies, when they continue to try to move money out of public schools and into private schools, they continue to be faced with growing numbers of demonstrators marching in the streets of Raleigh, North Carolina. Now, Raleigh's a pretty fair-sized city, about 400,000 people. It's 2 or 3 times the size of Springfield. But the first official Moral Monday March of this year was held in February, and the NAACP estimated that 80,000 marchers took place in that event. And that 80,000 people is a lot of people. That is enough to snarl the entire downtown streets of a city the size of Raleigh. I couldn't go then, but I wanted to attend the next march, so I started calling around to see when I could get it onto my calendar. And the day that I called, I couldn't find anyone at Reverend Barber's church who could tell me the schedule, so I called the NAACP office for North Carolina and got a recording there. So Barber's a disciple pastor in North Carolina. I used to be a disciple pastor. I pulled out my trusty disciple church directory, and I called the disciple church there in Raleigh where the marches take place to find out when the next one would be. The pastor wasn't in, but the office administrator was more than happy to help me, but she told me, "Reverend Barber? No, I don't believe I've ever heard of Reverend Barber." "Did you say Moral Monday? I've never heard about Moral Monday. I don't think we have demonstrations in Raleigh." Now, I'm not saying that it's impossible not to notice tens of thousands of largely black people walking past a very white church, and I don't want to call names because I wouldn't want the Hillier Memorial Christian Church at 718 Hillsborough Street to be in any way embarrassed by this story. But I have noticed that it is awfully easy for white people to not see black issues. I've noticed that it's awfully easy for the comfortable middle class to not be aware of what's going on the other side of that drive-through window. I've noticed that it's awfully easy for people who've gotten their kids through school to not be aware, not know about cuts to public education. On Thursday morning, while we stood and shouted, "This is what democracy looks like," and we yelled at cars turning into McDonald's to order their Egg McMuffins and bacon, egg, and cheese biscuits, we yelled, "Low pay is not okay." But they ignored us. They pulled up to the window, gave their money to employees who couldn't afford to buy an Egg McMuffin and whose children will endure unspeakable violations and violence because we do not regard them as being worthy of a living wage. They don't know the words to labor union organizing songs. They've never been taught that they should refuse to cross a picket line because it's only because of the generations that did refused to cross a picket line, that anyone ever got a 40-hour work week, or weekends off, or paid vacations, or access to health care. They don't know that it's only when the pilots support the flight attendants, and the carpenters support the plumbers, and the electricians support the teachers, that anyone ever gets a decent wage, the opportunity to retire with dignity, and a chance to see the doctor when they're sick. Even the Springfield Police Department members are members of a labor union, but they are complying with directions to go out and bust up union organizing of service workers. I love the old Buddhist parable that we read today. Everyone flees in the face of an oncoming warlord's army, but one Zen master. And the murderous warlord taunts him, saying, "Don't you know my reputation? Don't you know I could run you through with a sword without batting an eye?" And the master can calmly say, "Don't you realize that I can be run through without batting an eye?" It is that courage that finally speaks truth to power. And without it, everyone continues to flee before the warlords. Who is the powerful person then in this Zen parable? Is it a dozen heavily armed and badge-wearing policemen, or a fry cook who insists that his children should get to live in a safe neighborhood, go to an adequately funded school, see the doctor when they're sick, and have a shot at going to college when they graduate from high school? We keep running from the warlords. And until we stop running, they will continue to own us the same way a rancher owns a herd of cattle. The cars filled with people talking on their cell phones, rushing to get to work or school, could not be inconvenienced to just this one time go somewhere else for their breakfast sandwich, to make a little sacrifice out of compassion for the poor people who serve them. They didn't know. And they won't hear about it in the news, I guarantee you. They won't learn about it in school either. And heaven knows they're not likely to hear about it in church. 2 years ago, when the police were breaking up Occupy Wall Street demonstrations that had spread across the country, protesters often warned the police, "The whole world is watching." So that same warning got echoed in the Middle East during the Arab Spring as millions took to the streets to demand freedom from oppressive governments. They cried out, "The whole world is watching." But the whole world isn't watching. We watch for a moment, but we know more right now about Justin Bieber's drunken run-ins with the law and Miley Cyrus's nearly naked efforts at gaining public attention than we know about the plights of millions of innocent people in Egypt, Syria, and Pakistan, or how the voters' rights laws are being changed in Virginia and West Virginia and North Carolina and South Carolina and Texas and Georgia and Alabama right now. Because the revolution, men and women, will not be on the news. The revolution will not be televised. The corporate media will not tell you about it. Public schools will not teach the real history and philosophy of the labor union movement in America. The churches that worry primarily and exclusively about their own survival will not challenge the machinery that creates poverty. The politicians who gain their seats in power by the largesse of wealthy donors will not tolerate it. So the revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not happen until people of faith decide that they're no longer willing to act like they're a cadaver on the table just waiting to be dissected. The revolution is either live or it's not going to happen. So I'm ready for some resurrection up in here. How about you?
You've been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at reverend.ray@aol.com for more information.